In this section, we're going to take a closer look at some of the ideas within Greek Golden Age philosophy and religion, but mostly philosophy, where we're going to take a look at the ideas that were being formulated, not because that were just distinctive to that time, but that many of them, in terms of the Western European culture and the idea of Western civilization, we're going to carry these ideas forward. They're going to be debated and redebated over time. They're going to show up in the Middle Ages. They're going to show up later on in societies and cultures. And in many ways, for some of you who might be taking a philosophy course, these are still famous philosophers whose ideas are still being studied to this day, and we want to take a look at some of the ideas that they've been working on. Before the golden era of Athens, there had been other people who had been advocating for philosophy. Now, philosophy is a fancy word for love of wisdom. Now, exactly what that means depends on the society. But in the one that we're talking about here with the Greeks, let's just offer a little bit of an overview. Sophists, okay, they were thinking in terms of your ability to argue, okay, to use what's called rhetoric, to organize your argument or your thoughts to win an audience over, to almost, if you want to put it this way, to be persuasive speaking, all right? Now, one of the knocks or one of the detriments that people saw was that they were not, when they were spinning what was called their sophistry, they were not interested necessarily in fact. They played a little fast and loose with factual data. Instead, what they were trying to do was simply win an argument, to phrase it the right way, use the right vocabulary, and sway the audience, win them over as if it was a marketing campaign on TV. All right? So some of the early understandings of what is happening in philosophy, many people have a negative connotation. They don't believe it was something that was about exploring factual truth or coming to some vital conclusion. It was more of a sales tactic and sort of a marketing message. So the following philosophers we're going to talk about, in many ways, were reacting against that. The first one we want to think about will be Socrates, and he, of course, will be dying in 399 BCE. His student is Plato, who saw and worked in Athens, Plato saw Socrates in the streets, listened to him, followed him around, had direct contact and listened to him. And then the third in line of these major philosophers will be Aristotle. And in this sense, these are the three classic Greek philosophers that are going to supply a significant amount of information about speculation and knowledge in the coming centuries inside of European history. Doing in a short term like this a clear understanding of exactly what all of the philosophy of each of these men was about is, of course, not going to work. I'll refer you back into your textbook for more details. I'm going to offer sort of an overview of how they operated, and then in a few more sessions when we're talking more about medieval and late medieval history, these ideas will be back in forms and they will change, but we'll be referring back to them later. In many senses, okay, Socrates was the ultimate sort of model. By training, he's an Athenian, he's a stonemason, he lives a free life in Athens. He's not a professional educator, he's not a professional teacher, he's not a professional politician. He, in many ways, has conversations with people where, in essence, what he's trying to do is explore what they know and what they do not know. Now, many of us like to believe that we know everything we're talking about. Well, we'll leave that aside for a moment. Socrates would go after that for a second and keep asking questions, not in the sense of just trying to be annoying, but asking questions to get to the point where you could understand that maybe you don't know what you're talking about. Now, his intention was not to destroy and annoy people, all right? He was simply trying to say, I want to understand, could you give me more information, right? In essence, what Socrates says is that he wants to have a conversation. And what we have here is what's going to be called classically the Socratic method. It's a way of having a conversation, either real time or in writing, where the intention is that it's not really a conversation, it's just a way to explore ideas. And you look at these conversations, these dialogues, they don't sound like real conversations between people. What they are, though, is a way to try to get at information, a question and response kind of way of getting at information and of education. And Socrates was famous for this. Now, we all know enough that, for example, we don't want to have our 5-year-old nephew ask us the same question 100 times of why the sky is blue, all right? Now, we'd be tempted to offer him an excuse that says, because it is, and that's the end. That's not an argument. That's not even a response. It's just that I don't want to deal with this question. You'll learn about it later. On the other hand, your 5-year-old nephew, you're also going to start to talk about, well, light as it enters the atmosphere is made up of a variety of colors of light all mixed together that looks like, and the absorption of certain colors by nitrogen in the atmosphere, no, okay? Education and knowledge have to be age appropriate. In the context of what Socrates is trying to do, his method is actually just simply about speculation. The idea that he can go and get information and speculate, openly question, and constantly observe and take apart ideas to understand what they really are. That is what Socrates did. Now, in the process of doing that, he made a lot of people angry. He made a lot of people unhappy, and he would ask a lot of questions. He would always say that he himself knew nothing. He laid claim to not understanding and controlling everything in the world. He simply wanted to explore information. He did not write ideas down. He did not charge people for his teaching. He was fully thinking in terms of being a civic-minded Greek citizen who sincerely was looking for information. Now, in the process of doing that, he collected some followers around him who speculated on various things, and in essence, by 399, at the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, where there's great struggle and great strife inside of Athens, okay, Socrates is brought under charges, varying from corrupting the youth, whatever that means, to not believing in the gods or goddesses, as a sort of a profanity, essentially. As an old man who's a citizen, he could accept exile. You may have read in earlier chapters about the idea of ostracism in Athens, where you could essentially vote somebody out of Athens as a way to punish them or to remove them if they're political trouble, right? Themistocles, the famous general, had been ostracized. In this case, Socrates is going to be ostracized. He's going to have to go into a forced, stay outside. He's going to have to go into exile. He's an old man. Instead, he accepts a cup of poison and drinks it, and he dies. Now, from one perspective, that's a very heroic and interesting thing, because remember, Socrates has always said that he was working for the betterment of the whole community, the whole polis. He was a true citizen. And now that the other citizens have judged him to be somehow in the wrong or a threat, he accepted their judgment. Socrates' student was Plato. As you can probably tell, as Plato was seeing this happen, he's already kind of predisposed to not like democracy, not like the direct intervention and activity of everybody. Because Plato believed that Socrates was a great man, and that's why he followed him. There's lots of other people who believe that Socrates was a great man. Plato, if you think about this for a second, seeing what the general population and public opinion had done to his master, it's not going to be a stretch to think of Plato as someone who's probably very skeptical of the idea of popular power or democracy, right? So we'll take a look at a couple of things he did. First, Plato was obsessed with the idea of what is real. And what it was simply this. Plato believed that the world that we existed in was like a kind of a shadow or a parallel world, that there was a perfect one out there where all the forms of everything was perfect. There's a perfect chair and a perfect cloud and a perfect human. But he lived in a world, and we all lived in a world, where we're using our senses, which can be easily deceived, and we get a pale and very weak understanding of the reality that's around us, right? He's thinking that there's a perfect someplace else and an imperfect here. Now, that could fit into some religious concepts later, but for now, I want to think about this way. Plato is offering essentially a vision where there is a very corrupt, very broken down world we live in, and it needs to be fixed and controlled. In that kind of spirit, he writes lots of different things down, but he also writes what's called Plato's Republic. It's a complex document. It's a formal political science treatise or long explanation of what's going on in politics. What I'd like to highlight for a second in terms of Western civilization at this point is that Plato is trying to lay out an idea where hierarchies are good people know their place in society, and that you let the most intelligent people run a society while others essentially are told what to do, right? He creates a society based on essentially class, and the class is essentially by how intelligent you are and how valuable you are to society. That is his motion. That's what he tries to create, and it's called the Republic. Now, it's of course much more complex than that, but he is reinforcing the ideas of hierarchies because, in part, thinking what had happened to his own master, Socrates, had spoiled him on the idea that everybody should have a voice equal to others, that there are people who are different and there are people who are more intelligent. That is where that is going. So let's take a look at that, and hopefully it's also in your text that you're reading. The third sort of successor in terms of Greek philosophers here is Aristotle. Now, Aristotle's had an opportunity to hear about lots of different forms of philosophy. He's very interested, and he's trying to come across and figure out what's what and how is how and what is why, right? He wants to investigate. So Aristotle is going to be more in tune with the idea of essentially research. Take a look at an idea, do as much research on it as you can. Try to understand all the different angles, investigate it, test it. And then take a look at your senses, right? Use your ability to observe in the world and figure out how you want to use that to understand larger concepts and ideas. In this world now of the Greek Golden Age, we have emerging ideas in multiple levels, intellectual and otherwise. What we also need to take a look at, and this is probably the best time to do so, is the complexity of Greek religion. Now, when we talked about religious ideas in Egypt, in the various places in Mesopotamia, we had talked about polytheistic religions with ritualistic ceremonies, and in many ways, these were, of course, all public, state-funded. For example, we talked earlier about the idea of Ka, the idea of the pharaoh being a representative of the divine, not just a man in Egypt, but a link to the divine. Here's another idea. Greek religion is different. It has a polytheistic belief. There's lots of gods and goddesses. Many of you might recall some of the names of the 12 chief gods who live on the top of the Mount Olympus in Greece. Zeus, the chief male god, who's later on in Latin will be called Jupiter, or Aphrodite, who's going to be the goddess of love, right? And later on in Greek, when the Greeks' ideas are adopted by the Romans, she'll be renamed Venus. Okay, we'll get back to some of these. But the idea here is that there are gods, there are multiple ones, they look like humans, they act like humans, they behave like humans. For some of you who may have seen in the Iliad by Homer or the Odyssey, gods and goddesses interfered in the lives of common people. And it wasn't fair, a god versus a human, but they did so, and they did so quite regularly in Greek belief. In the system of the polytheism that is working here, the idea, if I could put it this way, was to make sure that publicly in all rituals you make all the goddesses and gods happy. For example, the goddess Athena was the patron god of Athens. So the Parthenon, that giant temple on top of the Acropolis in Athens, is her temple. This massive structure, this massive temple is in honor of her as sort of the patron deity of the city. Other Greek city-states had different gods or goddesses, but the idea was the same. Humans are, in Greek culture, to ritualistically, through various ceremonies and songs and burnings and offerings, to placate and to make the gods and goddesses happy. The last and interesting thing about Greek religion is that also many people wanted to know the future. That's a thing that's quite common in many different cultures, learning what the future holds. Some cultures read tea leaves, some read palms, some read the stars. In Greek religious belief, there were a series of oracles, and where you could go and ask for a question of a goddess or a god. And divination is the idea that you can see and understand physical things to foretell the future. All right? Reading the stars in a certain way, or there's lots of different ways. The most famous one is the oracle at Delphi, where you would write a question on a piece of clay and drop it down a well, and then the local priestess would interpret your question for you, supposedly with the aid of the god or goddess, god Apollo in this case. Usually very cryptic language, very unclear, but nonetheless, the Greeks are striving for answers. They're looking for signs. They're looking for their gods and goddesses to show them the future. And notice that this is a ritualistic and a public religious faith. There's no concept here of a deeper understanding of heaven or hell, or good or bad, or judgment day. It's almost as if the goal of a Greek man or woman was to avoid ever coming to notice of the gods and goddesses, because what they had read in much of their literature, if you came to the notice of a god or goddess, it probably wasn't going to end well for you. Be sure to take a look at the development of Greek philosophy, history, architecture, and the arts in the chapters that you're reading, and do, of course, take a look at those sample questions.